Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this new seminar of the Standing Group on the EU. We have the pleasure today to have a presentation on a very topical issue, namely democracy protection and the rule of law in the EU. We have Theuns as a speaker today. He's Senior Assistant Professor of Political Theory and European Politics at the Institute of Political Science in Leiden, and Associate Researcher at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics at Sciences Po Paris. And his presentation will be discussed by Christopher Bickerton, who is Professor in Modern European Politics at Polis and Official Fellow at Queen's College at the University of Cambridge. So Tom, you will have 40 minutes to make your presentation, and then Chris will have 10 minutes more or less to discuss, and then we'll open the floor for questions and comments. So Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Can everyone hear me okay? Maybe a couple of thumbs up. Yeah, great. This chapter that I'm presenting, it's written as a chapter and it's part of a larger book project. So maybe I first start by giving a bit of context about where in the book it fits and what I'm trying to do in the book overall, and especially kind of what the limitations are of what I try to do methodologically and what the kind of things are that I want this chapter to do in that broader book's argument. So the chapter is the first substantive chapter of a book project which I have. The book is coming out in November, and the title of the book is Protecting Democracy in Europe, Pluralism, Autocracy in the Future of the EU. And what I try to do in the book is I break up the question of responses to democratic backsliding into two parts. The first part of the book analyzes in different ways the sorts of responses that the EU has had to democratic backsliding, I would say, since around the year 2010. So starting with the constitutional crisis in Hungary around 2010. And then in the second half of the book, I want to, after arguing that these responses were ineffective, but also arguing that they were normatively flawed, so that they were they suffer from incoherences when it comes from the kind of values angle. In the second half of the book, I want to argue for a different approach, which I frame around the idea of pluralist democracy. And the second half of the book argues essentially for three separate types of responses. One of them is correcting complicity in democratic backsliding. So I argue in the first half of the book that quite a wide variety of actors in the EU institutional context, including member states, pro-democratic member states, are complicit in democratic backsliding in other member states, and that complicity generates some duties of redress and of reparation. Redress is stopping the complicitous act or omission, and reparation is repairing to some extent harms that are done by the primary wrong, which is democratic backsliding. The second of the three steps of responses that I propose in the second half is structured around containing autocracy in European politics. So this is about containing autocratic actors on the EU political scene to the extent that that is legitimate and coherent with the EU's fundamental values. These themes of legitimacy and coherence are ones that strike throughout the book for reasons that I'll go into in just a moment. And then the third of those three steps is that I argue that EU actors should be much more proactive in cultivating pluralism, cultivating pluralist democracy in contexts where pluralism and democratic government is under threat. These different approaches are argued for on normative grounds. So sure, I think that empirically there are reasons to think that they might be more successful than things that have been tried up to now. But fundamentally, the project is one of political theory, and what I try to argue is that these responses would be coherent with the EU's fundamental values. They would be good ways to express a commitment to democracy. They would be ways to, like I said, to correct certain, to redress and to counterbalance certain culpable either actions or omissions that have been done, certain wrongs that have been done in the context of democratic backsliding in EU member states. And in that sense, I'm doing something quite different than a lot of the empirical literature on democratic backsliding, which evaluates responses on the whole based on their supposed efficacy. Right, so I'm not making a causal argument grounded in efficacy. I'm making a normative argument grounded largely in coherence. The book then ends a little bit where it begins, as we'll see with this chapter. It ends in considering membership, and it ends by considering the justifiability of expelling a member state in the extreme circumstances where a member state becomes what I call a frankly autocratic actor. And there the idea is that the three responses that are just very briefly summarized in a nutshell, they are things that should be done. They are duties that are held in certain cases by different EU institutional actors in the light of democratic backsliding, but they might not be successful. And the types of responses, perhaps more robust responses that we might expect would necessarily have the result of regime change, those sorts of responses are generally unavailable to actors at the European level, and for reasons of a lack of legitimacy, a lack of legitimate authority. For example, the imposition, so the kind of coercive imposition of certain procedural democratic norms is just something that's out of the question in the context of European integration. Not only for kind of pragmatic reasons, but I think also for very important normative reasons. And so I say, look, where this strategy of protecting democracy in Europe fails, then there needs to be recourse to something else to resolve a fundamental problem, which is continued association with a frankly autocratic state in this hypothetical. And we can discuss whether or not it's a hypothetical or whether it's actually the case right now, if that interests you in the discussion. And I say that basically expulsion is the politically legitimate, the appropriate final sanction, the ultima ratio of this process of democratic backsliding, where these interventions have been made, so these three types of interventions that I described, and where they have failed. Okay, so that's the second half. In the first half of the book, I evaluate responses as I analyze them over the past, let's say, 10, 15 years. This chapter is one which I hesitate to call historical because I do not, in describing certain developments in the 1990s, I do not want to say that the story that I'm telling in this chapter, the story that I'm telling today with you, is one of describing a set of necessary and sufficient conditions which bring about certain specific changes which lead to democratic backsliding, or to lead to a very weak response by EU actors to democratic backsliding when we get to the 2010 kind of moment in Hungary, and then later in Poland and other member states. So instead, methodologically, what I'm trying to do here is do what I call a genealogy, and the idea there is that I'm basically analyzing the past, analyzing things that have happened, trying to create a narrative that helps us understand certain aspects which I think are broadly overlooked, or which haven't sufficiently been discussed and considered, of this weak response from the 2010s onwards. And the two kind of aspects that I want to draw attention to are depoliticization, which has been discussed in other contexts, and with slightly different angles also in this context, and what I call membership fatalism. I think these two flaws of the EU's response, of EU actors' response. I say the EU, sometimes I say EU actors. What I mean is essentially the main institutional actors like the Commission and the Parliament, but also the European Council and the Council, and therefore also by extension the member state governments that participate in those institutions, and their membership fatalism, and I'll say a little bit more about what I mean about that in a minute, and this kind of depoliticized attitude to the 2010s, they are best understood from my perspective, from my analysis. I say they're best understood by tracing certain developments in the 1990s Two of those developments I focus on in this chapter. One is the development of a sanctions mechanism as a response to the Big Bang enlargement. So in the early part of the 1990s and picking up a bit in 1993, 1994, we see increasing concern amongst the older member states that the Big Bang enlargement, so basically the accession procedures which are opening, rapidly opening with a number of Central and Eastern European states, that these will undermine the kind of coherence of the European Union when it comes to fundamental values, and that pressure leads to the creation of a values sanction mechanism, which is now institutionalized in the Treaty in the European Union as Article 7 TEU, which we know fairly well, I think, by now. And the second kind of process whereby increasing attention was given to fundamental values was the kind of democratic deficit debate. So democratic deficit debate is a largely academic debate, but also very much in political terms, we see that Euroscepticism rises in this period. We see that there's increasing the end of what's been called the permissive consensus regarding European integration. So European politics becomes a lot more politicized. Now, why? So this is I want you to realize that this is a strange kind of argument at this stage, because I'm arguing that we see membership fatalism and depoliticization around 2010 onwards in the response of EU actors to democratic backsliding in EU member states. But I say that to understand those processes, those flaws of EU responses, because I think a lot of the weakness and a lot of the subsequent failure, normative failure, not only empirical failure, but normative failure of these responses can be then tied back to a history of the 1990s, which is a history of the politicization of democracy and a story about the development of sanctions mechanisms. So if anything, this seems to be a kind of paradoxical story that I'm telling. And but that's nevertheless the kind of story that I want to tell. And I want to try to argue that we can better understand 2010 onwards with a light to this politicization in the 1990s and in this sanctions development. And let me take those things then in turn. So the first kind of development that I want to explore in order to make this argument is the idea that the way the sanctions, the value sanctions mechanism, which eventually becomes Article 7, the way that develops, holds in it. Firstly, I should probably start with the caveat that there's something itself rather unsettling about this nervousness that we see in the early 1990s, right? So one thing I draw attention to in the chapter is that this idea that the states opening enlargement talks, so accession talks, around 1992, 93, 94, that sure, they have recent experience of totalitarian rule, they have recent experience of authoritarian politics, but many of the earlier member states also, when they became members, and certainly when membership was being negotiated, had fairly recent experience with authoritarian politics. So the argument that the reason why we suddenly need to develop kind of a sanctions arm in the treaties is due to this Big Bang expansion with the inclusion of Central and Eastern European states is somewhat disingenuous itself, given the recent histories with fascism that we see in Germany and Italy and Spain and so on. So there's something already a bit awkward or odd about that as it comes up. But nevertheless, we have this drive from sanctions. And what we see then, if we look at actually how the sanctions arm develops in legal terms, is we essentially see that some elements of this sanctions response is initially lifted from development politics. right? So we see the rise of, let's say, conditionality in development is something that's also happening in kind of simultaneously, or that happens just before this separate discussion of a value sanction mechanism, and these two are related, I argue. And then the specific sanction that we see arise in Article 7 in the Lisbon Treaty, which is essentially a copy-paste article from the Constitutional Treaty, has these strange features which are difficult to explain and difficult to understand if we think really that the sanctions mechanism is in fact designed to respond and to have this kind of strong political response to fundamental values violations. And the reason for that is as has been now well rehearsed, some of the failures procedurally of Article 7, namely the unanimity requirement in a key procedural step of Article 7, and the specific sort of sanction that is then proposed, which is essentially a sort of disenfranchisement, so a sort of political containment in the council. But there's no real translation ultimately of this conditionality logic that we have from development, and that comes much later. That comes when we start to look at the rule of law conditionality regulation, which of course is no longer referred to by that name for all sorts of interesting and pertinent reasons. So conditionality then comes way down the line in the latter closing years of the 2010s. Okay, so we have this to take stock. Then we have this debate over sanctions in the 1990s, whereby there's the proposition and the possibility that the violation of fundamental values could be responded to with a sanction, but then the ultimate sanction that's decided upon is this heavily kind of neutered and extremely political sanction, which has the dual feature of being, on the one hand, something that has been described as a nuclear option, because the political sanction that it then describes is almost, it's been described as functionally equivalent by Swiderski, functionally equivalent as expulsion, in the sense that you lose basically an unlimited, an open set of the rights deriving from the treaties, while remaining, of course, subject to those treaties. There's another story that we can tell about the 1990s, which is one that I introduced earlier, and it's about the development of this politicization over democracy. It's the rise of Euroscepticism. It's the rejection in a couple of referenda of European treaties in this period by various populations. It's the rise of Eurosceptic parties, and it's essentially the questioning, the growing concern with expansion of EU authority in different domains, and questioning the unlimited teleology of ever closer integration. This dynamic in the 1990s is one which has an important role in helping us understand why the European Parliament becomes more empowered in this period over a series of treaties. It becomes and it also gives us a good lens through which to understand the ultimate inclusion of a procedure to leave the European Union. All right, this is of course missing from early European treaties, and it becomes instantiated in Article 50 which was used then by the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. This moment, so these two stories, I argue, are interlinked. We have this idea of giving up the vanzelfsprekendheid is the Dutch word. It's very rare that a Dutch word comes to me first because Dutch is really not primary language, but it's the obviousness, it's the self-evidence of ever closer union and of further integration, which is given up through the codification of a procedure to leave the European Union. Basically at the same time, we have the codification of a sanctions, a value mechanism, which can sanction the violation of fundamental values. But then the correlate logic, which is that membership itself is something that potentially could be on the line when we consider the ultimate sanctions violations. This is something that is explicitly then suppressed. So it's concretely discussed during the drafting of the constitutional treaty, which then becomes the Lisbon Treaty. It's concretely discussed, and then it's ultimately abandoned. And the reason that it's abandoned is given as, well, membership is a one-way street. We have essentially we cannot violate this idea that your membership is sacrosanct, essentially. But then that's very strange from the perspective that at the same time we have the codification of Article 50 and the possibility to leave the European Union. What I try to argue for then is that these two dynamics could have had a very different response potentially, but the intersection of them as they in fact happened was this very basically stepping back. On the one hand, accepting that member states had the sovereignty to leave the European Union, and at the same time affirming that other member states could never sanction via expulsion a member state for violating fundamental values like democracy, the rule of law, equality, freedom, and so forth. These dynamics, in other words, they help us explain what I call membership fatalism. Membership fatalism being the idea that a member state, once a member state, so post-accession, of course, is the sole sovereign controlling their membership, no matter what the context. I've talked and I've presented the arguments also of later chapters in my book in other contexts, and it always surprises me, but it no longer surprises me, but it still strikes me how strongly some people react to even the theoretical discussions about the possibility of expulsion in hypothetical circumstances which are relatively extreme. We're talking about whatever you might mean by a frankly autocratic state. So a state engaging, for example, if we're going to blow this example into a kind of caricature, right? A state that is suppressing media pluralism, let's say, not only by the means that we know of and that we've seen in states like Hungary and Poland, but in much more dictatorial fashions that we see, for example, now in Belarus and Russia and other countries of the like, right? Even in those hypothetical circumstances, some people find it very confrontational to consider the possibility that the sovereignty over a member state's inclusion as a European member state is not something that is in the sole control of, and then depending on who you speak, the government of that member state or the people of that member state. These are this fatalism is best understood from my perspective as being a reflection of these two dynamics. So of the kind of compromise that was made around the end of the 20th century, whereby member states gained the possibility to leave, and that they did not give up the sole jurisdiction and sole sovereignty over their membership in the context of a values mechanism, so a sanctions mechanism. That's part of this genealogy that I want to present to you and want to discuss with you today. The other part that I look at to try to understand this membership fatalism and this depoliticization, and one that potentially speaks more to this dynamic of depoliticization than the first, surrounds the response to the election of the FPÖ in Austria in 1999, and their inclusion, so the election in 1999, their inclusion in government in the beginning of 2000. And that's a very specific, we've moved from like fairly macro story of certain dynamics of European integration from the 1990s to now a very specific set of historical events essentially in the year 2000, because I'm interested in the EU responses and in European responses to that inclusion. Now, again, without speaking too much about this, because it's not central to my argument, that there's something also a little bit weird about the response against the FPÖ initially, because it's not the first time that we see a radical right-wing populist party that has a role in government. That's something that we see before Austria, in Italy, for example, where essentially there was no European response. So there's again a kind of puzzle as to why things are like that. I think one of the many reasons, one of the many things that we need to recognize is the sort of public persona and the larger than life kind of persona of Jörg Haider himself, the far right leader, this populist leader in Austria, who was at the head of the FPÖ, of the Freedom Party of Austria, but also potentially the leadership of Portugal in the council. So the rotating presidency of the council was held by Portugal, and their government was extremely had a very kind of stark position on the inclusion by Haider. Now, there's if we look at the specific response by European member states to the inclusion of the FPÖ in the Austrian government, we essentially, so the elections, for those of you who don't have these elections in mind every day, the elections led to the center-left party, the Social Democratic Party, being the first party, but having lost a great deal of vote share. The FPÖ comes in marginally ahead of the center-right Austrian People's Party, the ÖVP. And because combined the center-right and the populist radical right have a far stronger showing, but also because of kind of fatigue with center-left, center-right cooperation, it's seen in Austria as fairly evident that the move is going to be a center-right, populist right government. So after a very short period of trying to form a government, the Social Democratic Party gives up the let's say the initiative to form a government and gives it on to the two right-wing parties, the center-right party and the populist far-right party. And it's at that point that the European member states make essentially an ultimatum to Austria, and they say that they will impose essentially a sort of cordon sanitaire on the Austrian government, censoring and sanctioning, politically sanctioning the government if it is to form a government with the populist radical right. There's the threat, and then there's essentially the threat is ignored, and very quickly the Austrian center-right and populist rights form a government with certain concessions already built in. So the concessions that were built in included Jörg Haider himself not taking a position in the cabinet, especially not a leadership position, and basically that the highest positions of leadership go to the center-right party, even though they gained marginally fewer seats. Okay, so essentially the response is already one which has failed, right? Because the response is phrased as an ultimatum, and if we consider that the ultimatum had the objective to lead to the FPÖ not being part of the government, then it fails almost immediately, which helps us to explain why ultimately the sanctions that are then imposed are so weak and so incoherent, and why they break down after a relatively short amount of time. What we see then is indeed we see the other member states sanctioning the Austrian government, but doing so bilaterally, so doing so outside of the European treaties. Now, of course, that's not entirely surprising because it's very hard to sanction someone for a potential future violation, right? The argument was could not be that there were concrete violations of the Austrian government which had just formed against, for example, migrants, or the kind of litany of violations that we might expect from a populist far-right party in terms of minority rights and Islamophobia and so on. So instead, we see these series of bilateral sanctions which have a kind of EU stamp on them because of their being kind of organized by Antonio Guterres, who we all know now very well in another context, but was at the time the Portuguese Prime Minister, and therefore acting on behalf of the Portuguese rotating presidency of the Council. What we ultimately, because there was no way out of those sanctions, in the sense that their purpose was not to garnish some kind of change, as you might have in a kind of more traditional conditionality context. The purpose was really to back up this threat. But then when the threat had already failed very quickly in February 2000, it wasn't very clear what these sanctions were going to be doing. And indeed, what we see very quickly is that that the unity of the EU response amongst the 14 remaining member states fails rather quickly. So we have some kind of political responses. The European Parliament passes a resolution which condemns FPÖ participation in the Austrian government. The Committee of Regions passes a resolution of the same kind of sort. But ultimately, member states are trying to figure out how to back out of this kind of brinkmanship which they had put upon themselves, I suppose. They do so in the kind of expected way, I suppose. They form they extract some kind of symbolic concessions. The Austrian government makes some declarations, and ultimately there's a report, a kind of wise men report, unfortunately referred to also in that term, which gives the other member states an out before the end of the year even. So in the autumn of the year 2000, we see the advice coming from this report, which is kind of extra institutional report, which says, okay, there has been no violation. There have been some changes. There have been some concessions. Let's give up these sanctions. Now, of course, there had to be an out, and this was the way it went. But this was perceived by many of the participants as a humiliation, as a failure. And indeed, it was a failure in many senses. Perhaps it wasn't a failure in all the senses. It could have been spun differently. It could have been spun as a break on the populist agenda of this government. It could have been spun as a success in terms of securing the exclusion of Jörg Haider from cabinet. Instead, it was really kind of across the board considered singularly ineffective and messy and certainly to be avoided. What I argue then, so after kind of recounting this story, I want to make clear that I'm not arguing that the appropriate response would have been stronger sanctions, or that even the kind of threat of the 14 to Austria saying, don't form this government was legitimate. I don't want to say anything like those things. What I want to say is it helps us to understand the depoliticization of responses from 2010 onwards, when we consider that many of the actors involved, for example, Franz Timmermans, for example, many of the bureaucrats involved, in thinking through, and many of the political actors involved in thinking through the responses to the Hungarian constitutional crisis of 2010, for example, have this relatively recent memory of this humiliating failure of a sanctions response. And this is a more overlooked, I would say, part of what helps us understand why ultimately especially the initial responses are so narrow, are so legalistic, are so framed in terms of, for example, very specific infringement actions which lead to very minor de jure reforms which basically don't solve the problem but then are accepted as concessions that are adequate to solve the problem. Right? I'm thinking, for example, about the reforms to the retirement age of judges in the Hungarian Supreme Court, where and higher courts, whereby a huge number of judges were retired, and then a very small number were ultimately, as a response to an infringement sanction, ultimately reinstated, and then the commission says, okay, this is fine. To understand that, we need to understand this fatalism, I argue, because ultimately, if the Hungarian government is going to be a player in European politics, basically until they decide otherwise, then what matters more is maintaining that relationship and maintaining constructive kind of perspective on that relationship. And this depoliticization. So the idea that a political response, which is what had been tried in 2000 so badly and so incoherently and so clumsily and so messily, was such a failure and was so humiliating, and therefore should be avoided. So the last part of this chapter, I try to link those developments that I've described to these flaws, firstly, to these ideas of membership fatalism and depoliticization, and then try to show how in the early responses to Hungarian and Polish backsliding on democracy and fundamental values, and in this chapter I use only the Hungarian and Polish examples, although in other chapters I look at a couple of other examples as well, that we can see how those play out in the early responses of European actors to democratic backsliding. There's a key quote that I want to give by Franz Timmermans. So this is Timmermans actually speaking in 2015. And he's speaking at the University of Tilburg in the Netherlands. He says, "I believe that the case of Austria with Jörg Haider's party joining the government has weakened the EU's capacity to react to Hungary. It was a political response which completely backfired." Right? This is the sort of idea that I want to flesh out and want to explore in this chapter. Just to end then on setting this chapter in the rest of this first part of the book. So where I move on from, whereas this explores using this kind of genealogical method, these flaws, how we should understand the weakness and the legalism of European responses and the narrowness of European responses. The next chapter, chapter 3, looks at actually trying to see how EU actors conceptualize democracy itself. So what I do there, building on work which I did with Alvaro Oliart, who I saw earlier in the audience as well, is I look at a very broad set of speeches by European commissioners and try to see, okay, how do commissioners in the Juncker and von der Leyen commissions, how do they speak about democracy, and how does the way that they speak about democracy show us something about how they understand democracy? And there, the analysis really falls in line with what I'm saying here about depoliticization and legalism, in that what we see when we study these speeches is we see a very technocratic, a very legalistic, a very depoliticized conception of democracy itself. And then in the fourth and final chapter of part 1, I take a more philosophical approach, looking at the incoherences that I argue are internal to some of these responses. So both some of these tools, in that they have not been used to some extent. So Article 7 is a great example for me, in that there's lots of reasons to worry about Article 7 in terms of its efficacy, in terms of these procedural constraints. But I also want to argue that Article 7 has some normative incoherences internal to it, in that it tries to protect democracy through anti-democratic means, that is exclusion in the council, while maintaining a state's subjection to European law explicitly in Article 7.4. And then I want to argue, so essentially I want to go through, and I go through certain other responses, both ones that are more developed and more used recently, like conditionality, and more political responses, some of them rather obscure, like the possibility to deregister political parties, for example, in the European Parliament. Okay, I think I am out of time. It's 4:45. I had 40 minutes possible, so I'm going to stop there. I'm very much looking forward to Chris's comments and your questions and the discussion.
Thank you very much, Theuns. And I give the floor to Chris.
Okay, thanks very much, Natalie. Thanks, Tom. I'll see if I take 10 minutes, maybe a little bit less. We'll see how we go. So Tom, first of all, thanks for sending me your chapter. I enjoyed it. It was a nice chance to try and familiarize myself a little bit more with your argument in a bit more detail. There are a few bits of the book which you have written about already, which seem sort of quite closely connected to some of the issues which you've raised just now in your presentation and in your chapter, but it's not things that you've actually said very much about. So I would quite like to ask you questions on those things as well. So in that sense, we range a little bit further than the chapter that you sent, but it's just things I'm curious to have a discussion with you about. Okay, so let me just go through in order just some of the points that I've written down, starting from the chapter, I suppose, and then working beyond it. I suppose you said it yourself, but ostensibly it's a sort of history chapter. I think what I found most interesting in it was possibly the history, and so any sort of comments might be sort of more history if possible, please. I mean, some of it I thought was quite intriguing, but you sort of went over it quite quickly. So the sort of connections that you trace between the emergence of this sanctions mechanism, broadly described, that has some relationship to the notion of what the EU's fundamental values are, the connection between the enlargement process and then this specifically political period of the early to mid 1990s, that seemed to me really interesting. My feeling, and I think you can have gestured at this, you sort of mentioned this a bit yourself as well, is that the enlargement side is maybe less convincing, just because all the previous enlargements could very logically have led to the same development, but they didn't. Maybe this enlargement had something about the scale, something about the scale facing the changes that were coming up within the EU that meant that there was more concern about it. But it does seem to me that the more convincing question, or the more convincing sort of dynamic, is what you describe in terms of the emergence of a fairly solid sort of Eurosceptic sentiment across a number of different member states in this period, and the consequences that that might have for the EU. I suppose my question was really to kind of get you just to say a little bit more about the connection between some of the difficulties they've experienced in ratifying the Maastricht Treaty, for example, why sort of emerging Eurosceptic sentiment might lead to thinking more seriously about some sort of sanctions mechanism. It makes sense in terms of thinking about exits, I think, sort of logically speaking. But that seemed to me, just connecting the dots there, I'd be really interested just historically to try and tease out what was going on there. I thought there's quite a lot of sort of logical and sort of normative argument in the chapter as well. And so maybe, I don't know, moving some of that elsewhere and just really focusing on trying to work through the different sort of arguments historically that you were making. The cases I thought were good, but I thought maybe we could say more about them. And the Austrian case is one that I want to ask you about quite a lot. But it felt as if you said something at the beginning of your talk, which was that your argument is, I wrote this down, your argument is not about sort of effectiveness, it's about the coherence connected to a particular normative model that you have. But a lot of the judgments that you make are based on effectiveness, and the model itself seems, or whatever you develop as a normative model, seems not separable from your views about the effectiveness of existing strategies. So the historical chapter I thought was really good. I'd be interested in more about that, to be honest. And the rise of Euroscepticism and the connection to your story seems to me they're really interesting. Basically, the point that I sort of want to make there is that it seems as if the concern about the quality of democracy within the European Union has emerged in relationship to developments that are taking place broadly within Western European democracies. That seems to be an interesting sort of historical claim, if that's true. It may not be, but if that's true. Two sort of subsequent points that I want to make. Natalie, give me a wave when I sort of get to the beginning of the end time-wise, okay? Because I'll just sort of get lost in my thoughts. So Austria was a great case, I think. There's so much to say about that. So I mean, there's a lot of there that, to be honest, I felt we probably disagree on this. So in the case of Austria, you're making a really strong case that the entry of the FPÖ into essentially a party of government, sort of broadly speaking, and the ramifications that had for Austria's diplomatic relations at the end of 1999, early 2000, and the EU's response. It's an interesting case for you because it then helps you set the scene for all the subsequent responses that are, in a sense, trying to avoid what, from the EU's perspective, you're describing as this sort of Austrian debacle. You know, it didn't work the way we responded. It was much too political, as you've said. The EU had to climb down. It was rather embarrassing, and it didn't work. So subsequent developments have reflected a desire to avoid this Austrian experience. But if we go back to the case itself, that's, I think, what I'm most interested in. What really you're trying to say about the Austrian case. So I found there's some stuff about the way you judge the EU's response that I wasn't clear about. So let me just have a series of questions for you. What would be the standard of success in responding to the specific problem that was posed by the negotiations, the coalition negotiations between the centre-right party and the far-right party in Austria? At that time, so not later, but then, would the standard of success have been that the FPÖ decided not to enter the government at all? Yeah. It would seem logical that maybe that's what you're sort of thinking would have been a good outcome for the EU if whatever it did, that was the result. But then you say yourself, and this sort of takes us towards the nub of the problem, you say yourself, the FPÖ commanded a pretty strong support base within Austria, manifested through electoral success. Now, it seems reasonable that they should have some political representation as a result, at least according to sort of basic democratic standards. So that's not what would have been a good outcome. You wouldn't have wanted to avoid the FPÖ having a governing role because that would undermine sort of broadly, you know, people vote and the party gets some power if they get lots of votes. So if that's not the outcome, then what would have been a good outcome? Would the FPÖ have had to have publicly reneged on all of its statements of the past, yet nonetheless enter a coalition? Would that have been sort of a discursively positive outcome for you? So there was a phrase in your chapter which came up as on page 12, and you said something like you obviously want to respect the FPÖ's democratic mandate, which I think was the word that you used, but you also judge the EU's response to have been a failure. So the question there really is, under those circumstances, what would have been a success for you? Because some of the things that you described seem already quite a big sort of step back on the part of the FPÖ. Nevertheless, you don't judge it a success. So that's sort of important. The case of Austria, I think, is kind of also interesting because it raises this issue of what the problem really is. So if you think about the reason why the FPÖ was gaining sort of in popularity over the course of the 1980s into the 1990s, some of it was to do with certainly the ability of the party, especially once it's led by Jörg Haider, to articulate a mixture of sort of xenophobia and anti-Semitism, certainly, to kind of legitimize that sort of language, which for a long time after the Second World War had not been acceptable in Austrian politics. The emergence of the FPÖ also came on the back of the successful campaign to become president of the country by Waldheim, and there was a big scandal about his war record. Nevertheless, he was still president of the country. So there's a sense in which, yes, the rise and the popularity of the FPÖ expressed a certain falling away of inhibitions that might have been present in Austria about certain political opinions after the Second World War. At the same time, it has to be said, Austria was going through a pretty serious, quite profound change in its political, social, and economic model. For the first time in Austria's post-war history, had systematic strikes taking place in the late 1980s, based around a lot of privatization decisions that were unpopular. If you look at the voting composition of the FPÖ, they started to hoover up a lot of working class votes in Austria, of people who were quite seriously affected by this process of what the elites called modernization. Now, if you think about trying to identify what the problem the EU has to respond with, it makes you think, well, is the problem one of rule of law in the Austrian case? Is the problem of what was going on in Austria was a mixture of, popularity for a far-right party, plus a lot of opposition to social changes taking place within Austria? What exactly is the problem that's going on there that the EU would be responding to? It seems to me that the Austrian case is really interesting, but it's quite a complex case of how do you respond to something where the problem itself probably needs to be picked apart, and some of it from democratic standards pose no problems whatsoever. There seem to be expressions of discontent manifested through changing electoral coalitions. Do I have time to talk about Poland, Natalie?
You have more or less 1 minute, 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, then let me ask you a question, which for me is a sort of, I framed it as the Polish problem, which may not be the way you perceive it, Tom, but it may be the case. Okay. Now, at the end of your chapter, you had this really interesting remark about the Polish elections, the 2023 elections. At the time when they happened, I thought about many things, but I did think about your argument as well. It seemed to me that it posed a big problem. So just to be as quick as possible, in 2022, okay, before the elections, would you have characterized Poland as going towards some sort of frankly autocratic situation? Were you building your argument about expulsing a member state based on thinking maybe about a country like Poland? Certainly Hungary probably you had in mind, but maybe Poland as well. It seems to me that the change of government in 2023 would suggest that had your sort of expulsion mechanism been enacted at that time, you would have cemented for a generation a peace government in Poland. It would have been completely counterproductive based on your sort of desired outcome because of all the opposition to the EU that it would have generated. What happened instead was not really any intervention by the EU, it was just the play of democratic politics. And in this case, the government lost and the opposition won. And therefore, the change of government means that the whole rule of law problem is not solved by any stretch of the imagination, but has fundamentally changed from what it was before the election. So I guess my sort of framing about the Polish problem is how it fits with this argument you make. In your chapter, you say that the EU did involve itself very seriously in the elections by making clear that there's a lot of money at stake. And actually, some of the victory of the opposition can be attributed to people realizing that if they voted peace, they would lose a lot of EU money. Now, that seems to me to sort of be, to really go to the heart of what I think is the difficulty with your argument, which is it acceptable to undermine national democratic standards through external intervention in order to strengthen or improve national democratic standards? If your argument was about democracy at the pan-European level versus at the level of the member states, it seems to me there wouldn't be so much of a problem. But your concern, I think, from the book is not about the level of democracy within the EU as a whole. It's about the quality of democracy within the member states themselves. And there I think you have this difficult position of defending the quality of democracy at the national level whilst recommending interventions that would seem to me to pose problems for democracy at the national level. Okay, that's my thoughts. Sorry for going over time a little bit. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you very much, Chris. So Tom, if you want, you can reply to some of Chris' comments and questions, and then I will open the floor for other questions and comments.
I would love to reply, but I will try to be very brief, although it's gonna be a challenge. Okay, so one of the things that I'm learning from some of your comments is that I was already worried that I was doing a bit too much throat clearing in the chapter about that it's not history, that I'm doing a genealogy, why that matters, how it's different, that I'm not making a causal argument, that I have this ambivalence which you've noted as well about, on the one hand, the failure of the responses, on the other hand, the FPO being at that stage, elected by a large number of electors in Austria in free and fair elections. So having a kind of legitimate role to play in democratic politics by basically any reasonable democratic standard. What I'm starting to feel is that maybe I need to do, unfortunately, a bit more throat clearing rather than less, because some of the questions show that I haven't been clear enough about a couple of the things that I want the chapter to do and what I want the chapter not to do, or what I'm not intending to do. What I mean is the following. So there are certain kind of historical arguments that I'm making. But essentially what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give an interpretive political science type argument that certain developments which are somewhat overlooked, or which have not been paid enough attention, help us understand other developments. And the developments that I'm interested in, and the developments that the book is largely about, have nothing to do with Austria, have nothing to do with the 1990s. They have to do with these developments from 2010 onwards. And that explains, I think, some of the ambiguity and some of the lack of clarity regarding both the historical method and these normative considerations that you sketch out. Essentially, I mean, for the purpose of the book, to put it bluntly, I don't care often what the specific causal links are that might be necessary and sufficient to bring about certain outcomes in this story. What I care about is trying to understand how it's possible that in 2010, after this period of politicization, after this period of EU expansion, in terms in terms of breadth, but absolutely also in terms of depth, in terms of increasing competences, increasing powers, how the response can be so flat, so weak, so timid. It seems to me a real puzzle, and I think we can better understand that timidity once we reflect on these developments in the 1990s. That will mean that I potentially don't give satisfying amount of history in regarding these developments. So what causes them in the 1990s, and I think I have to bite that bullet. So this also helps me clarify the Austrian case in the sense, so in the following way. Again, for the purposes of the book, I don't care if the response was legitimate in the year 2000. I say at some point like that, that I don't really think it was, and that there's some trouble, and that we should worry about the democratic legitimacy of these sanctions for the reasons that you flag. But ultimately, it's not a premise in the argument. What I'm trying to understand is why, from the perspective of EU member states and EU actors such as Commission actors, etc., themselves, this was experienced as a failure. So when I talk about it as a failure, I mean that the actors involved reflected on it and considered it a failure. I mean that Frans Timmermans in 2015 can say that it basically cut the responses to Hungary under their feet, and to try to understand that. Then when we're actually, so if you come to an application of my position on democratic legitimacy, on pluralist democracy, I completely agree with you. The responses, especially given that they come at the coalition building stage before any violation takes place, the threat of broad political sanctions, this kind of supranational cordon sanitaire, which would be imposed on Austria by all the other member states, if they form a government, like not about what the government does, but if they form a government with this party that has the support of a wide number of citizens in free and fair elections, this is deeply, deeply troubling from the standards of democratic legitimacy. That's not to say you can't give a political response saying, this party is problematic. They have positions that we find deeply troubling. Standards of human rights, minority protections, and so forth. These are essential. These are fundamental to European integration. Blah blah. You can say all of that, but to respond without violations having taken place seem to me deeply problematic from democratic standards. It's just that's not what the chapter's about, right? The chapter's not about trying to evaluate EU responses to Haider and the FPÖ in 1999 and 2000 on the grounds of democratic legitimacy. The chapter is about trying to understand how EU actors in their responses, or in the lack of their responses, to Hungarian backsliding from 2010 onwards, might have this kind of hangover from the Haider affair, informing some of their action and especially some of their inaction. Effectiveness in that sense is very important in this chapter, much more than the kind of model of democratic politics that I prefer, that I in other chapters try to give normative reasons for my readers to accept. In that the EU actors reflect on the failure in terms of a failure of effectiveness, even though, as I try to say very briefly, even though there was another interpretation possible, which is that that these kind of political responses might have acted as a layer of protection, as a kind of insulation for minority rights and so forth in Austria, and had the very concrete effect of Jörg Haider not taking a position in the government, and the FPÖ not leading the government, strictly speaking. So effectiveness has a very important part to play, not in the overall argument of the book, but in the argument that these developments are important ones to help us understand these processes which lead to membership fatalism, which lead to depoliticization. Just a couple of comments on the last point that you made. So there's two things. There's the first way you framed it is, would I consider Poland moving towards, Poland in that period moving towards becoming a frankly autocratic state? I think the answer is clearly yes. Was it close to becoming a frankly autocratic state? I think the answer is also rather clearly no. There's still real political pluralism in Poland throughout the PiS government period. And while there are some serious violations of EU fundamental values, especially the rule of law, democratic pluralism, so that the fairness, ultimately the fairness of the elections, while tainted to some degree by slaps, lawsuits against critical journalists and academics, by the misuse of public media as a propaganda branch for the government, right? So there's all sorts of things that we should be very worried about, but we're not reaching. For me, we were not reaching the kind of step whereby expulsion would be a legitimate response, and especially not given that I think that ultimately expulsion. So what expulsion does is it protects other member states from the anti-democratic effects, also domestically, of association with an autocrat. And ultimately, I think expulsion should be understood in that way. So there are democratic costs to expulsion. The democratic costs to expulsion are mainly borne by the citizens of an expelled state, especially those who have no part to play in that state's democratic backsliding, right? Especially and a fortiori those who have been resisting the autocratization of those states. They pay a very heavy price indeed for their state's ultimate expulsion. The beneficiaries, if you want to put it in that way, are the gains that other EU citizens make in terms of their own civic freedom at not living as subjects of laws that have been co-decided by an autocratic government. What I think is important, though, is that we see this step not only as so one thing that I want to argue for, and that I'm consistent in arguing for, is that it is the legitimate final political step, final political section, but also that it's the ultimate, that's the ultimate ratio, right? That there are a series of necessary normative responses, normatively necessary responses that precede an expulsion, a move towards expulsion, which is a real good faith effort to support pluralistic actors in some pro-democratic actors in states where democracy is threatened, combined with these actions to contain autocratic politics at the EU level, where to the extent that that's legitimate, and responses that seek to correct complicity, for example, in financing authoritarian leaning governments.